Morning, children. How are you? Okay, fine. In the last class, we had finished our discussion of the first chapter of the book Politics in India since Independence. Today, we are going to begin our another book, Contemporary World Politics, the first chapter from that book, that is the Cold War era. Children, this concept is very vital for you to understand the Cold War era. Fine. Basically, in this Cold War era, we shall be discussing about dominance of the two superpower USA and USSR, because their dominance was central to the Cold War and thereafter the various arenas of the Cold War. Before going to that, children, what you need to understand that this entire chapter, the Cold War era, that will give you the glimpse of this book, Contemporary World Politics. And at the end of this chapter, when we will discuss that Cold War started ending, so the end of the Cold War is usually seen as the beginning of the contemporary era in world politics. Are you getting my point? Yes, the end of the Cold War is usually seen as the beginning of the contemporary era in world politics, which is the subject matter of this book. Fine. That's why it is most appropriate that we begin with the Cold War. Our discussion must begin with the Cold War and how the dominance of these two superpower, because the basic factor behind this Cold War was the dominance, the power rivalry between these two superpower those days. Fine. And thereafter, tracking the various arenas of the Cold War in different parts of the world. And how can we forget about the non-aligned movement? Isn't it? Non-aligned movement as a challenge to the dominance of the two superpowers, and it also describes the attempts by the non-aligned countries to establish, because as we will be discussing that the non-aligned country, they also established one new system that is known as New International Economic Order, NIEO. Yes, children, it was a means, NIEO, as a means of attaining economic development and political independence. Two things: political independence and economic development. So, finally, we will conclude with our assessment of the role of our country, with India's role in non aligned movement, with India's role in NAM, and asks how successful had been our policy, how successful the policy of non aligned has been in protecting the interest of Republic of India, in protecting the interest of our country. Fine, children. So, what is very important for we all to understand, and for you to understand here, the beginning of this Cold War and the incident that is known as Cuban Missile Crisis. Yes, children, Cuban Missile Crisis. As we know, Cuba is a country very close to America, very close to the USA. Fine. And it is a communist country, in fact, children. Cuba has been known for the rule of the communist leaders like Fidel Castro, Raul Castro. They both were brothers, in fact. They are no more. Okay. But the rule that had been ensured by them and the way the policy had been put forward, it was Cuba was a very important ally of Soviet Union. Okay. Now what happened actually? This was exactly the year 1961, children. It was the year 1961, April 1961. The leaders of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics of Russia, that is USSR, we say, they were extremely worried What had been the factor responsible for their worry? Why were they worried? In fact, they were worried that United States of America would invade communist ruled Cuba, because Cuba was ruled by the communist. Cuba was a communist country. Okay, so they were worrying that USA would invade Cuba and overthrow the rule of Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro had been the president of that very small island, as we know, nation of the coast of United States. And Cuba was a very important ally of Soviet Union, and it used to receive both diplomatic and financial aid from USSR. So Cuba was getting financial and diplomatic both kind of help from or assistance from USSR. Fine, children? Okay. Now, the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, yes, don't go by the name Nikita, but Mr. Nikita Khrushchev, decided to convert Cuba into a Russian base, so that Cuba must be protected whenever America tends to invade or America would try to invade, because and before it USSR wanted to convert it into a Russian base. For this purpose, in the year 1962, USSR placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. You getting my point? Yes, concentrate here. In 1962, USSR placed nuclear missile in Cuba. As it had been placed, so the installation of these weapons put the US came first time under fire from a close range. Okay, just imagine how difficult these circumstances were for the country like USA. Okay, so USA came under fire from close range, and 3 weeks after the Soviet Union had placed the nuclear weapons in Cuba, the Americans came to know. They became aware of it. And then President of USA, John F. Kennedy, okay, he convened a meeting with his advisors. So President and his advisors all were reluctant to do anything that might lead to a full-scale nuclear war. They didn't want a full-scale nuclear war between the two countries, the two most powerful countries those days. It was certainly a very good step, a clever step, a genuine step taken by John F. Kennedy and his advisors. Okay? But if they decided that not to go for a full-scale nuclear war, it didn't mean that they will do nothing, or they would allow the condition, or they would allow USSR to strengthen its position in Cuba. They were also determined to get Nikita Khrushchev to remove the missiles and nuclear weapons from Cuba. Now they started finding its way. Okay? Very soon they started implementing it, and the order had been given by US President Kennedy. American warships had been ordered to intercept any Soviet ships. American warships had been told that, see, if you find any Soviet ships heading towards Cuba, okay, you, as a way of warning the USSR of its seriousness, you had to intercept, you had to block their way, you had to stop them. Okay, and it must be done in such a way that it should be a clear-cut warning to USSR. Now, at this juncture, children, at this point, children, the clash seemed imminent. It was almost inevitable now. So this imminent clash, this inevitable clash, came to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. I hope the concept of Cuban Missile Crisis you must have understood. You must got it. Okay, this particular condition, when the clash was imminent, when the clash was inevitable, we say it, or it came to be known as Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, just imagine the prospects of this clash. It made the prospects of this clash made the whole world nervous. For what? For it would have been no ordinary war. Children, can you imagine that if USA and USSR, they both, or had they decided to go for a war, what would have been its repercussions? Okay, so surprisingly, and eventually to the greatest relief of the world, both sides decided to avoid war. And the Soviet ships slowed down and turned back. It was the best part by even USSR that they understood the seriousness of the condition. They also avoided and their ships slowed down and turned back. The whole world, the entire world, heaved a sigh of relief. An ultimate sigh of relief, children. Okay. So, now we need to understand that was it simply a power rivalry or a military rivalry? Before going to that, we need to understand that this Cuban Missile Crisis was a high point of what came to be known as the Cold War. And the Cold War, it exactly referred to the competition, the tensions, and a series of confrontations. What did it refer? It referred to competition, the tensions, and a series of confrontations between the United States and the Soviet Union. Did you get it? Yes. Fine. So, this Cold War referred to, I am repeating it once again, referred to competition, the tension, and a series of confrontations between the United States and the Soviet Union, backed by their respective allies. Yes, they were supported by their respective allies also. They were not alone. In this work, they were not alone. They were very well supported by their respective allies. Fine? Unfortunately, it never escalated into a hot war, or what we say a full-scale war or a full-fledged war between these two powers. And there were wars in various regions. There were wars in various regions, in fact, children. Okay. In those regions or the various regions, with the two powers and their allies involved in warfare. Their allies were involved in warfare and in supporting regional allies, but at least the world avoided another global war, another world war. Remember, First World War and Second World War. The casualties, the life loss, the loss of property. Okay, what had been its extent? Now, suppose back to back in the decade of 40s, Second World War ended, and again in the decades of 60s, had it been the Third World War, then for humanity, in fact, children, it would have been a question mark. How would we move ahead? Okay, but fortunately, this didn't happen, and at least the world avoided another global war. Fine. So this Cold War was not simply, if you think that it was simply a matter of power rivalries, of military alliances, or of balance of power, it was, certainly it was, matter of power rivalries, of military alliances, and of balance of power. But it was not simply, or we can't limit it, we can't confine it till this only. These were also accompanied by a real ideological conflict as well. What was it? It was a real ideological conflict, a difference over the best and the most appropriate way of organizing. A difference over the best and the most appropriate way of organizing political, economic, and social life all over the world. How one organizes, how one succeeds in organizing economic, political, and social life across the globe, in entire world. And for this purpose, we had two choices there, one, and the two groups there. We had one, the Western Alliance, headed by the USA, means the US. It represented the ideology of liberal democracy and capitalism. This question had been asked, children, in 2019 board examination, class 12th board. Okay. Differentiate between the ideology of Western Alliance and the Eastern Alliance. So Western Alliance, headed by the US, it represented the ideology of liberal democracy and capitalism. On the other hand, the Eastern Alliance was committed, or it represented the ideology of socialism and communism. Fine, children? Do you have any doubt? This is the basic concept of Cold War. And see, we also say that, see, Cold War is going on between two of you, between your friends, between some of us. Okay, so keeping that in mind, in this concept you need to understand. Any doubt you do have, you must ask. Okay, by the time, take care, stay safe. Any question you will have, must ask it tomorrow. Thank you.